So this is going to be fairly new for many of you. We will talk about some of the nuances in terms of dosage and frequency, but more so the focus is going to be on what practices we can combine San Pedro microdosing with, and why I believe it is the most potent and effective microdose to work with out of the three classic psychedelics. So LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, and wachuma, San Pedro. LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline. I truly do believe that San Pedro is the most effective microdose, and I will share a little bit why I believe that to be the case further on in the webinar today. So let's talk a little bit about Mike J's book, Mescaline, A Global History of the First Psychedelic. So the most recent podcast that we published with the Psychedelic Podcast, which I will drop a link to in here. The podcast that we just published, I think today or yesterday, was a podcast with Manveer Singh. Manveer is a PhD from Harvard. He wrote a book called Shamanism, the Timeless Religion. And in that book, he questions some of the hypotheses or theories that present ayahuasca and even the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece as these really ancient ways that we've worked with psychedelics. So there have been people who claim that we've been drinking ayahuasca for 1,000 years, as an example, when in fact archaeological evidence only goes back 300 years or so. One of the other sort of core themes or topics that's come up over the last 5 years, many of you may be familiar with this, was the Immortality Key by Brian Murarescu, where he made the case that the ancient Greeks infused a psychedelic into wine, and it was called kukian, and that they had these sort of ceremonial rituals with this psychedelic. And Manveer questions that, which you can learn more, if you want to go deep into that. We don't have the time today to really get deep into that, but you can listen to the podcast to learn a little bit more. What is, however, in my humble opinion, indisputable is that we have an ancient history with the cacti. So archaeological evidence goes back as far as 15,000 years ago. Okay, 15,000 years ago for peyote, which are the buttons that are in New Mexico, or current day New Mexico, Arizona, northern Mexico. There's archaeological evidence that goes back 15,000 years. For San Pedro, there's archaeological evidence that goes back as far as 4,000 years to 2000 BC. So with these cacti, we actually have historical evidence that we've been utilizing these medicines, these substances, for a very, very long time. Now, if you've been to some of my webinars before, listen to the podcast, one concept that I often talk about is the Lindy effect. And the Lindy effect is this theory or kind of basic idea that the longer an idea or technology has been around, the longer it will be around. And so the very fact that we've been working with these psychedelic cacti, these mescaline-containing cacti, for, one could argue as long as 17,000 years, potentially longer, that is evidence of its utility, that we keep coming back to it again and again and again. It's providing some distinct level of usefulness, whether that's for healing, whether that's for vitality, whether that's for fertility, whatever that might be. And so I think that's the first and most important aspect of the sort of ancient ally part. Now, to read a little bit about the sort of ancient use of mescaline, I'm just going to read some of the opening chapters here. One sec. So even if you just were to read chapter 1, it gives you a deep historical context around San Pedro microdosing as this ancient ally. And I do fundamentally believe this is a really important essence and aspect of this work. So a little bit about myself. Many of you know who I am, Paul Austin, founder of Third Wave and the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. We train industry-leading coaches to master the skill of psychedelics for individual growth and collective transformation. Here is what we will cover today: what San Pedro is and why it stands apart from the other microdoses. What are the key benefits and who is this for? We're going to talk a little bit about my signature microdosing protocol as it relates to nervous system mastery. Ethical considerations for practitioners, how to master the protocol. This is where we'll talk about our new level 1 training, which is an 18-week training, 6 weeks going through a San Pedro protocol, 6 weeks learning how to coach that same protocol, and then 6 weeks learning how to sell that protocol and enroll clients to start to generate revenue. So I already talked a little bit about what San Pedro is. So for over, I would say 4,000 years, really, this sacred cactus has been revered as a gentle teacher and healer in the Andes Mountains. San Pedro contains mescaline, the world's really first psychedelic, is what I would consider. And then because of its use going back with peyote 15,000 years ago, archaeological evidence, the cactus can be legally grown in most countries. I know we're talking about it in the chat. You can go to Home Depot, you can buy San Pedro at a Home Depot. The processing of San Pedro is illegal, however, because it contains mescaline, which is a Schedule 1 substance in the United States. However, there are centuries of safe and traditional use backing its gentle profile. And I know many of you have already talked about in the chat how you yourself have participated in San Pedro ceremonies in the past. As I mentioned, it is a phenethylamine, which is the same class of psychedelic as MDMA. Phenethylamines tend to be more dopaminergic, which helps with sort of lucidity, clarity, energy, but they still have this really nice, soft, heart opening effect. But as I've been working with it more and more, both microdosing and higher doses, I've come to realize and recognize how it's such a great balance between LSD and psilocybin. Psilocybin to LSD to San Pedro. I consider psilocybin to be the beginner. It tends to be shorter lasting, so it's around 5 to 6 hours. It's really accessible. My experience with psilocybin, it's a great beginner because it's not as intense. It can be combined with other substances, other like herbs and functional mushrooms, and it tends to be more serotonergic. So people notice when they work with psilocybin, it really brings them into their deep emotional body. They experience more somatic presence. A lot of folks love to work with psilocybin because it can help them to get off antidepressants. So a lot of people like the sort of natural part of psilocybin. LSD, however, is a little bit more advanced. You just need a tiny, tiny bit, right? With LSD, it's 5, 10 to 15 micrograms. It lasts for up to 12 hours. And it really is only best done twice a week rather than 3 or 4 times a week like psilocybin, because it tends to be a little bit more manic, a little bit more energizing. LSD tends to be much harder to come across, but LSD historically has been my favorite. And then in the last couple of years, I started to get into San Pedro. And I consider San Pedro to be sort of the most advanced of those 3 classic psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, and San Pedro, because it is 12 hours. It is a plant medicine still, and it can be very, very difficult to acquire. However, out of those 3, San Pedro has the greatest impact on inflammation. So there's some really interesting clinical research that has been done out of LSU by Charles Nichols, exploring the anti-inflammatory properties of psychedelics. And so in that work, he showed that of the 3 major psychedelic classes, so tryptamines, which would be psilocybin, lysergamides, which would be LSD, and phenethylamines, which would be San Pedro. Phenethylamines and San Pedro in particular had the greatest impact on inflammation, had a really, really strong anti-inflammatory impact. Now, the reason that matters is because what we're noticing with a lot of the anecdotal reports for microdosing is that it tends to be holistically beneficial. And so when we think of interventions or modalities that are useful for a wide range of conditions, really the 3 fundamentals are diet, sleep, and exercise. If you eat healthy, if you move more, and if you get high quality sleep, chances are that's going to address and fix a lot of health challenges, complications, or issues that you may be having. It seems to be that psychedelic use is this 4th sort of holistically beneficial medicine. And my understanding, these are not classic psychedelics, Philippe. Neither iboga or amanita are classic psychedelics. Those are very different compounds. So I'm talking about the classic psychedelics: tryptamines, lysergamides, and phenethylamines. Iboga is called an onarogen. Amanita, I forget what amanita is, but muscimol is the active ingredient in amanita. So for these classic psychedelics, they're really helpful and relevant. And so for San Pedro, right, that anti-inflammatory impact has a sort of broad beneficial effect at helping the body's natural healing mechanisms to become more activated. So it tends to be a 10 to 12-hour journey with a gentle gradual onset, heart opening and grounding rather than intensely cerebral, sort of able to balance both worlds. And I've mentioned the phenethylamine structure versus tryptamine. And so the key difference in my belief is that San Pedro's mescaline alkaloid works through distinct pathways that naturally support nervous system regulation because it's helping with cognition and neuroplasticity, but there's also something that's helping it to be somatically present. And the typical microdose, because I know that's a big question right now, is 0.5 grams to 1 gram. So this is a practitioner's protocol that we put together. And this is actually in our level 1 training. I'm gonna make this bigger. Hold on. In our level 1 training, this is sort of the didactic foundation. And so what we're going to talk even more about today is neuroplasticity through concurrent anti-inflammatory and somatic mechanisms. Our practitioner-focused framework leverages San Pedro's unique anti-inflammatory properties combined with targeted somatic practices to create optimal conditions for neuroplastic development and sovereignty cultivation. And that's why I said our protocol represents a paradigm shift in microdosing methodology, moving beyond cognitive enhancement towards comprehensive nervous system regulation. Core scientific foundation is the 5-HT2A receptor-mediated anti-inflammation. This comes from Charles Nichols' groundbreaking research that demonstrates that mescaline compounds in San Pedro activate 5-HT2A receptors to produce potent anti-inflammatory effects at sub-perceptual doses. This mechanism operates independently of psychoactive effects, which is a really important part. This is why microdosing seems to be so useful, creating a therapeutic window where neuroinflammatory reduction occurs without cognitive interference. The key research insight centers on mescaline's molecular structure, which closely resembles DOI, a synthetic psychedelic shown to suppress inflammation at doses significantly below hallucinogenic thresholds. This structural similarity positions San Pedro as the optimal choice among classic psychedelics for anti-inflammatory applications. Now, many of you know about the other existing protocols. And the comparative advantage is both the Fadiman protocol and the Stamix stack emphasize cognition and therefore are consumer based. So Fadiman's talked a lot more about mental health applications for depression and anxiety with a 1 day on, 2 days off schedule, while Stamix talks a lot about the neurogenesis that is catalyzed when combining psilocybin with lion's mane and niacin. And again, this is for a broad audience. Our protocol, the practitioner protocol, targets nervous system regulation through anti-inflammatory mechanisms with every other day dosing, positioning it as a sophisticated tool for practitioner application rather than consumer self-administration. This is part of what's going on from a biological mechanism architecture, neuroinflammatory cascade interruption. The protocol's efficacy emerges from 3 interconnected mechanisms. First, vagus nerve enhancement occurs as reduced systemic inflammation improves vagal tone and bidirectional gut-brain communication. Second, synaptic plasticity liberation happens when lower neuroinflammation removes constraints on new neural pathway formation. And third, parasympathetic dominance develops through decreased sympathetic hyperactivation, creating space for rest and digest states essential for integration and healing. And so when we combine that with somatic practices, right, we're combining these pharmacological interventions with somatic interventions. Breathwork enhances vagal tone during anti-inflammatory windows, while contrast therapy, so this is hot, cold, sauna and cold plunge therapy, builds adaptive stress response capacity without overwhelming recovery mechanism. Movement practices reinforce new neural patterns through embodied experience, and reflective journaling consolidates insights while tracking nervous system shifts. These practices work synergistically rather than additively, creating compound effects that exceed the sum of individual interventions. I could keep going, but I am mindful that that is quite a lot. In terms of looking for studies, I would recommend searching ChatGPT for psychedelics, anti-inflammatory mechanisms, and Charles Nichols, and it will give you a list of various research papers that he's published about the effect of psychedelics on inflammation. Stephen, you did. It's good to see you. Raquel, feel free to reach out. We'll get you hooked up. We'll talk a little bit more about that, Brindle, towards the end. Keep the questions coming. We have 180 people live with us, which I love. So keep the questions coming. We will have time for Q&A. All right, here's some of the San Pedro benefits. I've talked a little bit about it in the academic document, which I'm going to come back to because there's some more good stuff there about protocols. So people notice there's a lot of natural energy without any jitters or crash. So there's a gentle activation that sustains. I find the energy to be a little bit more embodied when compared to LSD. LSD does still tend to have a little bit more of a heady aspect to it. Psilocybin helps with energy a little bit, but I find San Pedro helps quite a bit more because San Pedro is more dopaminergic. So there's more dopamine with San Pedro, which then leads to greater mood, focus, and energy. The mental clarity often feels grounded, so there's this sort of balance. I almost look at it as like psilocybin is like 75% somatic, 25% cognitive. LSD is like 75% cognitive, 25% somatic. And I find San Pedro is like the perfect balance between the two, like 50-50. So there's a mental clarity and lucidity that comes online, but it's really embodied and in the heart, which I find is really helpful, especially for many of us or the clients that we work with who are burnt out, who have high anxiety, who are sympathetic dominant, who don't really have a regulated nervous system, right? And so that emotional balance can come online through nervous system regulation, not suppression. I talked a little bit about the anti-inflammatory action that reduces neuroinflammation at the cellular level, which then helps to facilitate neuroplasticity enhancement, creating new neural pathways for lasting change. And I think the defining or distinguishing feature of San Pedro microdosing is its calm over intensity, especially when compared to LSD. You get a lot of those benefits of energy and mood and awareness without overwhelming sensitive systems. What I do hear from clients here and there is LSD can be a little too stimulating, a little too activating. And if that's the case, I often find San Pedro to be a more regulated and grounding experience. So who is San Pedro for? I mean, I could literally just put on the slide, it's for everyone. High functioning professionals who can't afford to be destabilized but need deep change. Anxious overthinkers who get more activated, not calmed by LSD protocols, which I mentioned already. Sensitive, very like hypersensitive individuals who feel overwhelmed by intense psychedelic experiences. Burnout, people who have chronic stress, who need regulation before they can handle expansion, and anyone seeking transformation through embodiment rather than breakthrough. So this is a gentler, more nuanced, more subtle approach that can take time to really open up and emerge. Elements of an ideal protocol. This is pretty fundamental. Structured, intentional, responsive. So rather than one size fits all, how do we tailor that microdosing protocol to each client's baseline goals and sensitivity? And the goal is to create enough momentum for nervous system recalibration without tipping into overwhelm. So protocol structure and implementation. Active days. So with San Pedro, we're using an every other day framework. LSD, I find the 1 day on, 2 day off is ideal. This is the Fadiman protocol. With psilocybin, I find this 4 day on, 3 day off protocol to be more ideal. With psilocybin. With San Pedro, I love this every other day framework. The typical microdose that folks end up landing out is about 1 gram of San Pedro powder administered in the morning for optimal circadian alignment. And the intention is to align the dosing days by incorporating concurrent somatic practices to maximize the anti-inflammatory window. So integration days maintain a somatic practice continuation without substance administration, incorporating reflective journaling and nervous system calibration activities. And the protocol that we are teaching as part of the training unfolds across 6 weeks with 2 distinct phases. So weeks 1 and 2, the first 2 weeks comprise what I call the calibration phase, focusing on individual dose optimization, baseline measurement establishment, and starting to introduce basic somatic practices like functional breathing, a little bit of breath work, a little bit of movement. And then weeks 3 through 6, which is about 4 weeks in total, constitute what we call the implementation phase, featuring full protocol engagement, progressive somatic challenge introduction, so sort of amplifying or elevating the challenge of the somatic work that we're doing, and continuous tracking refinement. Slow is smooth. I love this. Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast. The nervous system sets the pace for sustainable transformation. If you try to overexpand the nervous system, if you try to push beyond the nervous system, it will end up coming back to bite you, right? And so it's very, very helpful to work with these lower doses as a way to build up to it. Okay, a couple more things. What are the biomarkers that we're looking at? I think these are an important part, right? When we're understanding when we're working with clients or we're working ourselves with microdosing, what are the biomarkers that we're looking at? Heart rate variability is a big one, right? Heart rate variability, or HRV, can often be found if you're wearing an Oura Ring or a Fitbit or an Apple Watch. You can get other tests done as well. It serves as the primary biomarker. There's a target range usually of 80 to 120 milliseconds, measured consistently each morning to establish reliable baseline. So heart rate variability is a great measure of nervous system health. And so that's a sort of objective biomarker when you're starting to work with clients or when you're doing this yourself to track and measure. The other thing would be sleep architecture, which tracks your deep sleep percentage, REM consistency, and recovery metrics. Again, through things like the Oura Ring. That's my ideal, is the Oura Ring, but there are other devices that you can get as well that help with sleep architecture. And then stress response metrics measure recovery time from cold exposure. Stress response metrics measure recovery time from cold exposure, breath hold capacity, and exercise recovery patterns to assess vagal tone improvement. One thing that we did mention in here, which I do want to emphasize, hold on, is blood work as well. Blood work can be a really relevant indicator for things like CHRP, which are it's a biomarker to measure inflammation, for cortisol levels, for various other things like that. I'm just getting my link and I'm going to share Function Health with you. Function Health makes it super easy. And this is a link that you could use to check out Function Health. They do 100 plus biomarkers. So I would also advise some clients to do a full panel of blood work before they start a microdosing protocol. They're specifically interested in these holistic inflammatory markers, and then to do another round of blood work towards the end of a microdosing protocol to see how that's changed. So I think that's another thing to integrate. You can also look at inflammation markers, so improvements in joint mobility, shifts in muscle tension patterns, and enhanced digestive comfort levels. Emotional regulation capacity reveals itself through modified responses. So how triggered do you still get when things come up? Can you keep a regulated nervous system even when there may be triggers that come online? And then somatic awareness develops through increased interoceptive accuracy, strengthened body-mind connection, and enhanced embodied decision-making capacity. A few other things. Technical knowledge requires understanding of the autonomic nervous system dynamics, which we've talked about prior. We haven't gotten into detail about today, but the autonomic nervous system is sympathetic versus parasympathetic, somatic intervention timing, anti-inflammatory mechanisms, and integration methodology. And this includes breathwork facilitation, movement therapy guidance, tracking interpretation, and client assessment protocols, right? Ethical considerations that you must complete a personal protocol experience before client guidance, establishing embodied understanding rather than theoretical knowledge. You must know the map rather than the territory, okay? You must know the map rather than the territory. Clear scope of practice boundaries prevent overreach into medical territory while maintaining therapeutic efficacy. And referral protocols address contraindications in edge cases requiring specialized support. The practitioner protocol represents a sophisticated evolution in psychedelic practice grounded in mechanistic understanding while honoring embodied wisdom. By positioning nervous system regulation as the foundation for expanded consciousness, which I truly believe it is, you cannot expand outside of what your nervous system is willing to do. This framework creates sustainable pathways for personal and collective transformation in an increasingly complex world. The convergence of ancient plant wisdom with modern neuroscience through the lens of somatic integration establishes a new paradigm for human development that transcends the limitations of purely cognitive or purely spiritual approaches, bringing everything together. All right, we're at quarter two. Let's talk about a few more details. I'll share a little bit more about the new protocol or new training that we have coming out. We still have a few spots left for that. So again, most microdosing protocols focus on dosage, neurology, and mental health. Fat Evan's protocol and the Stamets stack help set this precedent by recommending standardized regimens for LSD and psilocybin. My protocol is designed specifically for practitioners. This is the first protocol of its kind designed for practitioners who wish to help clients with nervous system regulation, which in my very humble opinion is the foundation for all mental health, for all physiological health. You have to heal the nervous system. You have to get the nervous system regulated, right? If you focus on that as a core principle, everything else that is positive and beneficial will emerge from that. So it weaves together a flexible framework. We talked about San Pedro and Wachuma, the every other day protocol with the unique intelligence of San Pedro. Not just psilocybin or LSD, built for regulation, not stimulation. That's a really important piece. Built for regulation, not stimulation. There is no one size fits all schedules. At times, it can be more than the microdose. That's why we incorporate somatic practices. If you look at all the other microdosing protocols, it's just about the drug. Ours is the first microdosing protocol to be intentional about how that's combined with very particular somatic practices, breath work, cold exposure, and body-based integration, because it builds it from the ground up. And these are the core elements to always consider when microdosing: substance, dosage, frequency, duration, intention, tracking, integration, and client profile. Substance, LSD, psilocybin, San Pedro. Dosage, start low, go slow, right? That calibration phase. We talked a little bit about frequency. LSD is usually twice a week. San Pedro 3 times a week. Psilocybin 4 times a week. Duration's an important one. Really, clinical research has shown that you need to be microdosing for a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks in order to see impact and effect from the microdose. So this is cumulative. This is not just about the individual day. This is about the overall trajectory of regulation, nervous system regulation, that microdosing is helping to support. Intention, keeping it grounded, somatic focused goals, daily, weekly check-ins, pair with somatic practices. Talked a little bit about that. We've talked about the somatic practices. And then also this, we must create safety as practitioners, staying within the scope and honoring each client's autonomy, knowing our role, supporting, not prescribing, right? This is about their sovereignty. This is about their inner healing intelligence and supporting the client and navigating that. That's really important. Stay aligned with legal guidelines, practicing harm reduction, screening, onboarding, and follow-up, to be mindful about that, to have integrity within that, I think is really important. And then, a big part of nervous system regulation is the modeling of nervous system regulation, which is why we emphasize in all of our training programs, we must walk the walk. We must do this work ourselves. And it's why even in our level training, which I'm going to talk a little bit about here now, we first have everyone go through a microdosing protocol themselves before they actually learn how to coach it and support others through it. You must be able to navigate that yourself and really go deep on it. There's more and more questions, so we're going to mark these as questions and get to them. All right, let's get into questions. Can you speak to the legality of microdosing? I'm familiar with the gray market, but as a licensed mental health counselor, I would not utilize illegal substances in my therapy practice with clients. Is there a legal loophole for micro amounts? Unfortunately, I choose to wait until things are above ground. In Colorado, Colorado is the one state where there is a legal loophole. What a lot of therapists do is they tell their clients, okay, I cannot help you source these substances. They are illegal. but they just send them to our website. Go to Third Wave. Third Wave is a podcast. They have guides. They have other resources. A clinical therapist that I worked with many years ago in New York told me, you can microdose before you come into these sessions. I can't provide you with any substance myself, but you can microdose. So I think empowering your clients, let them know you can microdose before coming in, but that you can't provide it is a good workaround oftentimes when thinking about this. What is an appropriate macrodose of San Pedro? Usually a macrodose of San Pedro is about 10 grams of powder, dried powder. So, because I think of a microdose as about 1/10. So if a usual San Pedro microdose is 1 gram of dry powder, a macrodose is usually 10 grams of dried powder. Since San Pedro sounds gentler and more balanced than both psilocybin and LSD, why do you recommend this as the third microdose substance to try after psilocybin and LSD? That's a great question. Partly because it's much more difficult to acquire. I also think it has more indigenous context because psilocybin I see is much more free and open. It's been used in every continent. You can grow it at home. Mushrooms are very accessible and available. The Mazatec do have an indigenous lineage with them, but it is also much more accessible and available. San Pedro is very much contextual to the Andes. And so I do think it's helpful to first have like a high dose ceremony with it to understand that context before starting to microdose with it. So those would be some of the things. Would microdosing San Pedro possibly help IBS and chronic fatigue? For sure, chronic fatigue. IBS potentially, although you would want to start low because with IBS, you may have some sensitivity to the alkaloids in San Pedro. Similar to psilocybin, when we take psilocybin at times, it can cause nausea. So you just have to be mindful of that. Henrietta, can you still do other substances at macro levels while following this protocol? You can, absolutely. You just usually want to provide a little bit of a window, a few days off before a macrodose and a few days off after a macrodose. Minimum 3 days before, minimum 3 days after, sometimes as long as a week or 2 weeks before, or a week or 2 weeks after. It depends on the substance, on the medicine. Ayahuasca is going to be longer. If you're just doing a high dose of MDMA or psilocybin, it would potentially be shorter in terms of that window. Microdosing San Pedro is not contraindicated with almost every psychiatric medication. The only psychiatric medication that microdoses of San Pedro are contraindicated with are lithium. So just like LSD and psilocybin, it is safe to take with most psychiatric medications. I wouldn't advise it necessarily. I do think it is helpful to wean off SSRIs or SNRIs or mood stabilizers or benzodiazepines or ADHD medications. I know quite a few people who have used a combination of San Pedro and LSD to get off Ritalin and Adderall, which we'll do a whole nother webinar on. But they aren't contraindicated, just so you have that awareness. A great point, Naz. So Naz is one of our graduates and facilitators. She said, hey, Paul, given the level of questions, looks like lots of people in here could do with the support of a trained psychedelic integration coach. If they aren't interested in the training, perhaps share the link to Third Wave's directory. So we also have a directory for everyone, just so you know, and you can find our list of coaches and therapists in the directory. So if you're looking for professional support for, a journey or a microdosing protocol, whatever that is, you could also look at our directory and find a qualified practitioner to help out with that. That was a solid hour. We recorded the whole thing. I know we went intensely deep into it. Those of you who are in our training programs currently or planning to enroll in the next one, we will send you this practitioner's protocol outlining sort of San Pedro microdosing and nervous system regulation. It can be really helpful as a sort of didactic framework for how to think about this work or teach or explain this work to the clients that you're working with. Thanks, Naz. It's good to see you. And I appreciate all of you showing up. I always have a lot of fun with these, and we'll have another one, I think not next week, but the week after, or next Thursday, July 17, we have another webinar coming up on how to navigate challenging experiences with psychedelics. So if you're a practitioner, a therapist, a medical doctor, or just someone who's going through this yourself, we will have a webinar on July 17th. Same time, 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time, on how to navigate the storm. When a client or when you yourself are going through a challenging experience, how do you handle that? How do you navigate that? It's good to see you all. Signing off. We'll see you next time.